because of this claim that they say they saw Jesus resurrected. Like, there's something different that goes on there.
Joe Rogan has heard wild theories, bold claims, and mind-bending conspiracies. But when faced with a historical case so undeniably compelling, even he had to pause. A man executed by the Romans, buried in a sealed tomb. And yet, history refuses to let the story end there. Could an event dismissed as religious myth actually be one of the most well-documented moments in ancient history? Skeptics have tried to explain it away, but what happens when even hostile sources confirm the impossible? Eyewitness accounts an empty tomb no one could deny. Rogan wasn't ready for this, and you might not be either. Stay with us, because by the end of this, you'll be questioning everything you thought you knew. Eyewitnesses that shocked Joe Rogan. One of the most staggering pieces of evidence for Jesus' resurrection is the claim that over 500 people saw him alive at once after his crucifixion. This claim comes directly from 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8, a passage written by the Apostle Paul, who says that Jesus appeared to Cephas, Peter, the 12 disciples, over 500 people at once, James, his brother, and finally to Paul himself. This passage is one of the earliest Christian creeds, dating to within 2 decades of Jesus' death, making it historically significant. For Joe Rogan, who often discusses skepticism, the idea of hundreds of witnesses seeing the same event was a shocking claim worth examining. Historians widely agree that Paul's letters are some of the earliest New Testament writings, and the creed in 1 Corinthians 15 is considered an even earlier oral tradition. The fact that Paul was writing within the lifetimes of these eyewitnesses is crucial. Anyone reading his letter could have fact-checked his claims by speaking to those who were still alive. If the resurrection were a fabrication, it would have been easily debunked by contemporary skeptics. Instead, the movement grew exponentially, with believers willing to face persecution and death for their testimony. The character of the hallucinations may be another essential factor. Some skeptics consider that probably there could have been a group hallucination involving the 500 witnesses. This theory, however, is problematic. Hallucinations are primarily individual experiences occurring in a person's mind, so it is almost unimaginable for hundreds of people to have the same vivid scene at the same time. Even present-day psychology supports this notion. Shared visual hallucinations are so exceedingly rare that they are almost unheard of. And since these encounters stretched for several days in various locations, the hallucination theory simply falls apart. 1st and 2nd century non-Christian historians like Josephus, Tacitus, and Lucian of Samosata have acknowledged that the early Christians believed in the resurrection. Even though they were not believers, they stated that Christianity was able to grow so rapidly because of the conviction of those who claimed to see a risen Jesus. This confirms the view that something extraordinary must have happened, whatever way one chooses to interpret it. Possibly the most powerful piece of historical evidence for Christianity would be the assertion that 500 people witnessed Jesus resurrected. And Joe Rogan shows the incredulity many skeptics who think the resurrection is a matter of faith have toward that information. Rather, the testimonies of these witnesses, the early date of Paul's letters, and their situatedness present a case that strongly suggests that the resurrection claim is based upon events that actually happened and could be established, not on sheer legend. Hundreds claim to have seen him alive, but what's next is even harder to explain. If this was all a lie, why didn't the ones who wanted him gone just shut it down? Why no one denied the empty tomb? One of the most overlooked facts about the resurrection is that even Jesus' enemies never denied the empty tomb. If the resurrection were a fabrication, the simplest way to disprove it would have been to produce Jesus' body. Yet no historical source, Roman, Jewish, or otherwise, records anyone claiming that Jesus' body remained in the tomb. Instead, opponents of Christianity claimed the body was stolen, which ironically confirms that the tomb was indeed empty. Matthew 28:11-15 records that Jewish leaders bribed Roman guards to say that the disciples stole the body while they slept. This explanation raises multiple issues. First, Roman soldiers were highly trained and executed for dereliction of duty. It is unlikely they would have simply fallen asleep. Second, if they had been asleep, how could they have known the body was stolen? Lastly, stealing Jesus' body would have done nothing to benefit the disciples, who preached his resurrection at the cost of their own lives. Another major problem with the stolen body theory is the transformation of the disciples. After Jesus' death, the disciples were hiding in fear, believing their movement had failed. If they had stolen the body, they would have had to fabricate the resurrection, convince hundreds of people, and then willingly face imprisonment, torture, and execution for a lie. Historically, people will die for something they believe is true, but not for something they know is false. The empty tomb is further buttressed by historical criteria used by scholars. With this criterion of embarrassment, a story is considered to have a higher chance of being true if it casts an unflattering image on its authors. In the Gospels, it is reported that women were the first to witness the empty tomb. Luke 24, 1-10. In the context of late 1st century Judaism, the word of a woman was considered unreliable. They could not even stand as witnesses in a court of law. If the disciples were making up a lie, they would never choose women to be the first witnesses, but rather male disciples. The lack of historical refutation of the empty tomb, combined with the failure of alternative explanations, would strongly indicate that resurrection claims were not the result of conspiracy or legend. Even skeptics such as Bart Ehrman, the agnostic historian, accept that the followers of Jesus truly believed him to have risen from the dead. This cannot prove resurrection, but it does prove beyond any reasonable doubt that something monumental occurred that changed the course of history forever. Did Jesus really die? The medical evidence. One of the most skeptical questions about the resurrection is whether Jesus actually died on the cross. Some propose that he may have survived the crucifixion and later appeared to his followers, a theory known as the swoon hypothesis. However, medical and historical evidence overwhelmingly confirms that Jesus did not survive. Roman crucifixion was designed to be the most brutal and effective execution method of the time. The Romans were experts in torture, and execution squads ensured that a person was fully dead before removal from the cross. In Jesus' case, the Gospels record that a Roman soldier pierced his side with a spear, causing blood and water to flow out, John 19:34. Modern medical analysis suggests this was a pleural effusion or pericardial effusion, meaning Jesus had already suffered massive trauma, dehydration, and cardiac failure. For once, the Journal of the American Medical Association published a work on the medical aspects of Jesus' death in 1986. This paper concluded that Jesus probably died from asphyxia, loss of blood, and shock. In other words, the dying in crucifixion usually needs to push himself bodily upwards so that he can breathe. After several hours of this agonizing torture, the person loses all strength and can no longer lift himself. As far as scourging is concerned, this procedure would further cause damage to his bodily tissues and skin and create an exsanguinating loss of blood. Series of death. Even if Jesus had been somehow able to survive crucifixion, he did not have the energy to inspire his disciples afterward. If a half-dead man showed up to his followers, they did not say, "He gained victory over death." They would have been rushing him to the doctor. The idea that a tortured, almost dead man could convince hundreds of people that he was God is far-fetched from a historical and medical perspective. The Roman, Jewish, and Christian sources all agree on one fact. Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Even the most skeptical scholars, the likes of John Dominic Crossan, a member of the Jesus Seminar and an atheist historian, say, "The crucifixion of Jesus is as sure as anything historical can ever be." For resurrection to take place, Jesus would thus have been dead and then having returned to life miraculously, a feat which no natural explanation can ever account for. Why didn't Jesus' movement die out? Throughout Jewish history, multiple individuals claimed to be the Messiah, gathering followers and seeking to restore Israel's sovereignty. However, when these leaders were executed, their movements quickly faded into obscurity. A prime example is Simon bar Kokhba, who led a Jewish revolt against Rome in 132 AD and was hailed by some as the Messiah. After his death, the movement collapsed. The same pattern occurred with other failed messianic figures. In contrast, after Jesus' death, his movement exploded, reaching distant lands and eventually transforming the Roman Empire itself. The question is, why? One of the key differences between Jesus and other so-called messiahs was the claim of his resurrection. Other movements ended in disappointment because their leaders remained dead, proving they were not the Messiah. But Jesus' followers, rather than dispersing in fear, boldly proclaimed that he had risen from the dead, facing extreme persecution for their belief. This shift is historically remarkable because the disciples, who had previously fled in terror when Jesus was arrested, suddenly became courageous preachers willing to die for their message. Something significant must have occurred to cause such a transformation. Another critical factor is the nature of Jesus' teachings. Unlike nationalistic leaders who sought military victories against Rome, Jesus preached about a spiritual kingdom that transcended earthly power. His followers did not seek to overthrow governments, but instead spread a message of forgiveness, love, and eternal life. This universal appeal allowed Christianity to thrive beyond Israel's borders, drawing in both Jews and Gentiles, something unheard of for other messianic movements. Jesus' death and resurrection became the central pillar of Christian belief, rather than an event that marked the failure of his mission. Persecution of early Christians, a historical testimony by itself, shows that Jesus' movement was indeed different. If the resurrection was an invention, why would his disciples be put through torture, imprisonment, and execution for something they knew to be false? Most early Christian leaders, such as Peter and Paul, were executed under the Emperor Nero. Without fighting back or recanting their beliefs like political rebels would have done, these early Christians remained steadfast in their faith to the point of martyrdom. This unwavering commitment implies they genuinely believed they had seen the risen Jesus. Opponents counter that zeal has driven others before to die for false beliefs, but such cases have typically involved what we would call those who were born against the first-hand accounts who claim to have seen it firsthand. Jesus' movement survived, unlike other movements, because the followers were so thoroughly convinced he had conquered death. This is unique within the annals of religious history. The rapid and expansive rise of Christianity from a modest Jewish sect to cast off the yoke of persecution and finally break through the barrier of Jewish communities. This is not unique to any other religion. Even secular historians agree that something unprecedented occurred after the death of Jesus that cast the history of the world entirely upside down. But why, if Jesus was not resurrected, did his movement survive and thrive when every other messianic movement failed? Roman graffiti about Jesus. One of the earliest known depictions of Jesus is not from a Christian source, but from Roman graffiti mocking him. Found in Rome's Palatine Hill, the Alexamenos graffito, dating to circa 200 AD, is a crude drawing of a man worshipping a figure on a cross, with the body of a man and the head of a donkey. The Greek inscription reads, "Alexamenos worships his god," ridiculing a Christian named Alexamenos. This graffiti, while intended as an insult, provides one of the earliest pieces of non-Christian evidence that Jesus was worshipped as a crucified deity. Crucifixion was considered the most shameful way to die in the Roman world. The Romans reserved it for slaves, criminals, and rebels. It was a symbol of disgrace, not honor. This is why the depiction of a crucified god was absurd and offensive to Roman society. In a culture that valued power and victory, the idea of worshipping someone who had been executed in such a humiliating way was seen as foolishness. This aligns with what Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 1:23, where he acknowledges that Christ crucified was a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. The growth of Christianity despite this scandal is very remarkable. Had the early Christians really wished to invent their religion, the last thing they would have done would be to choose crucifixion as the focal point of their faith. They would have preferred to paint the picture of Jesus as an exalted conqueror or a victorious king. The very existence of the Alexamenos graffito proves that the Romans were aware that Christians did worship a crucified figure and, in so doing, were mocked for doing just that. This serves as an additional pitch to the fact of early Christian steadfastness conviction in the face of public ridicule and persecution. It directly undermines the kind of modern skepticism that claims Jesus' divine status was an invention of later generations. If Jesus' followers had regarded him only as a teacher or prophet, there would have been no grounds for the mock pagans to refer to him as a crucified deity. That this view was widely ridiculed in the 2nd century implies that the belief in Jesus' divine status must have been present right from the very onset of Christianity. The Roman historian Tacitus himself, in the Annals, around 116 AD, places the persecution of Christians by Nero upon their belief in Christus, who suffered the uttermost penalty under Pontius Pilate. The Alexamenos graffito, then, ends up being very circumstantially relevant evidence for early Christian beliefs. Roman mockery, rather than erasing Christianity, actually preserved one of its earliest non-biblical references to the crucifixion and worship of Christ. How ironic that something intended as an insult should now stand as one of the earliest visual testimonies for the very center of the Christian message, that Jesus died on the cross and was worshipped as God, albeit with scorn and mockery. The Romans mocked him, laughed at his followers, and tried to erase his legacy. But history had other plans. Gospels were written too soon to be myths. One of the most common skeptical claims is that the Gospels were written too late to be historically reliable, suggesting they were legends that developed over time. However, historical evidence contradicts this idea. The Gospels were written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses, making it virtually impossible for myths to have replaced actual events. Unlike mythologies, which typically take centuries to develop, the Gospel accounts were circulating while those who had seen Jesus were still alive. The earliest Gospel, Mark, is generally dated to around 60–70 AD, less than 40 years after Jesus' death. Matthew and Luke followed shortly after, and John was written between 80 to 95 AD. While some skeptics argue that this is still a long gap, it is extremely short compared to other ancient historical biographies, which are often written hundreds of years after the events they describe. For example, the primary sources on Alexander the Great were written 300 to 500 years after his death, yet historians still consider them reliable. Additionally, 1 Corinthians 15, written by Paul around 54 AD, contains the earliest recorded creed about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. This creed, according to scholars, originated within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion, far too soon for mythological development. Historian Dr. James D.G. Dunn states, "This tradition was formulated as early as months after Jesus' death. This means the core beliefs of Christianity were not inventions of later generations, but part of the earliest Christian message." Yet another substantial argument against the legend theory states that there are embarrassing details in the Gospels that would never be fabricated. For example, Jesus' disciples are often portrayed as cowardly, doubting, and slow to get the chase of his teachings. Hardly the characteristics one would want to invent for the heroes of a budding religious movement. Had the Gospels been mythological tales designed to glorify the disciples, one can rightly assume that they would be presented in them as fearless warriors for the faith from the get-go. In the end, the dating of the Gospels comports with the standards of good historical documentation. Their early circulation, accessibility to eyewitness sources, and inclusion of discrediting details all point toward their actual history. The skeptics who suggest that time overloaded the story of Jesus with legend must explain how such a rapid legend could possibly arise as solid eyewitnesses remained present to correct the falsehoods. The inescapable conclusion points toward the Gospels as being historical biographies, debasing myths, and therefore warrants serious inquiry into their claims concerning Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Is it really impossible? Many skeptics reject the idea of the resurrection because it involves a supernatural event, someone rising from the dead. But is it truly impossible? Joe Rogan himself has acknowledged that the universe is full of unexplained mysteries, making it inconsistent to rule out the supernatural entirely. If one believes that the universe is purely material, then a resurrection is impossible by definition. However, if there is even a possibility that a supernatural realm exists, then miraculous events, including Jesus' resurrection, cannot be automatically dismissed. One key point often overlooked is that the existence of the supernatural is not solely a religious belief. Throughout history, people from different backgrounds, including scientists, philosophers, and skeptics, have reported encounters with unexplained phenomena. Near-death experiences, NDEs, quantum physics suggestion of multiple dimensions, and accounts of inexplicable healings all point to the idea that reality is more complex than pure materialism allows. If consciousness can exist beyond physical life, then an event like the resurrection is not necessarily irrational. In fact, the resurrection of Jesus stands upon a pedestal above all other religious claims. Whereas other religions speak of the ascension of gods or heroes into the heavens, Christianity alone claims that a known public figure who was executed by his people not only was raised from the dead, but did so in the presence of hundreds of witnesses. Such an accusation could not have been made centuries later, but arose immediately after the death of Jesus and had been vindicated in the face of dangers. If only a symbolic act, the resurrection could hardly have been the spark for starting a movement that would change the course of history. The scientific method does not automatically deny possibilities. It weighs evidence. If one assumes that the miraculous can never happen, there will be no evidence for anything. Yet if one ranks the resurrection documents with other historical claims about the same time, it becomes one of the most eminently attested events in antiquity. The critical question is not, was the resurrection possible? It is there any compelling reason to reject it, even before weighing the evidence? On mere principle, this question belongs to philosophy as well as to science. If something exists other than nature, that is, if there is a God, this would make miracles, including the resurrection, possible. Anyone who rules out the resurrection without considering any supernatural arguments does not merely adopt skepticism, but shows bias. The deeper question that the skeptics should be asking is not whether the resurrection is possible, but why were the early disciples, who were willing to die for what they believed, so convinced that it actually happened? What if Jesus hadn't been crucified? If Jesus had not been crucified, Christianity as we know it would not exist. Many people assume that Jesus' teachings alone were enough to create a movement, but this is not the case. The centerpiece of Christian belief is not just Jesus' moral teachings, but his death and resurrection. Without his crucifixion, Jesus would likely have been remembered as a wise teacher or failed revolutionary, rather than as the Son of God. The crucifixion itself was unexpected for Jesus' followers. They believed he was the Messiah, but their understanding of the Messiah was military and political, someone who would overthrow Roman rule. When Jesus was arrested and executed, his followers scattered in fear. Mark 14:50. This reaction was natural, as crucifixion was considered the most humiliating and shameful way to die. In Jewish thought, being hung on a tree, a phrase used to describe crucifixion, was a sign of being cursed by God. Deuteronomy 21:23. If Jesus had died another way, such as old age or natural causes, he would not have been viewed as someone who took on the sins of the world. Historically, crucifixion should have ended Jesus' movement, just as it did with other would-be messiahs. However, his followers did not abandon the movement. They became emboldened. Something significant must have happened to turn terrified deserters into fearless preachers who proclaimed that Jesus was alive. This transformation is one of the strongest arguments for the resurrection. Without the crucifixion and resurrection, there is no logical explanation for Christianity's survival and growth. Theologically, the death of Jesus is at the very heart of Christendom, for it stands for the atonement of sin. Without the crucifixion, there would be no soul of Christianity. That is, Jesus' whole purpose of sacrifice was to reconcile poor, lost man back to God. The died for our sins concept permeates every doctrine of the Christian Church. Had Jesus only taught and lived but did not die, he would not have fulfilled the messianic expectations of the Old Testament prophetic mandates, Isaiah 53, Psalm 22. In short, without the crucifixion, there is no Christianity. Jesus' movement would have faded, and he would hardly have been remembered in history. The crucifixion was not merely a regrettable incident, it was the central incident from which all of Christianity emerged, asserting faith in his resurrection, and that, after him, the worldwide faith came. An irony of history is that in order to extinguish the fire of his influence, the enemies of Jesus decided to kill him. But his death made the fire of his movement unwieldy. Counter-theories. If Jesus did not rise from the dead, the simplest way to disprove the resurrection would have been for Jewish or Roman authorities to display his corpse. Yet despite the extreme hostility toward early Christians, this never happened. Instead, Christianity spread rapidly, even in the face of violent persecution. Skeptics have proposed several alternative explanations, but none of them fully account for the empty tomb. The earliest counter-theory, recorded in Matthew 28, 11-15, was that the disciples stole the body while the guards were asleep. However, this theory is weak for multiple reasons. Firstly, Roman soldiers faced the death penalty for negligence. It is unlikely they would have fallen asleep on duty. Secondly, if the guards were asleep, how would they know the disciples stole the body? And lastly, most importantly, stealing Jesus' body would not explain the resurrection appearances to over 500 people. Another suggestion is that the followers of Jesus simply went to the wrong tomb. Yet this is ever so improbable, as Jesus was placed in a well-known and sealed tomb belonging to Joseph of Arimathea, Matt 27, 57-60. The Jewish and Roman authorities certainly knew the location. Indeed, any public showing of the body would have put the matter to rest and discredited the disciples. Instead, even dissenters unanimously admitted the tomb was empty, albeit trying to explain it by diversions. One of the strongest testimonies lies in the fact that Christianity began in Jerusalem, the city where Jesus was crucified. If the resurrection were a lie, there would have been no way to convince people in the same city where Jesus was crucified. His enemies, the Jewish leaders and Roman officials, had all the incentive in the world to prove the resurrection to be false, yet they could not. Instead of disproving it, they sought to cover up the missing body, which only asserted the fact that something extraordinary had indeed happened. The empty tomb is one of the best supports for the resurrection, as it demands an explanation. If Jesus had not risen, someone should have produced that body, but no one ever did. That fact alone does not necessarily point to a resurrection, but does give to it some historical credibility. So the question remains: if Jesus' body was never found, what did happen to it? That is the strongest argument for the resurrection. We've uncovered the counter-theories. But what happens when someone like Joe Rogan takes a closer look? Let's find out. Why Joe Rogan took the resurrection seriously. Joe Rogan, known for his open-minded yet skeptical approach to controversial topics, was notably intrigued by the evidence surrounding Jesus' resurrection. While Rogan often questions religious claims, he was particularly struck by the historical weight of the resurrection account, especially the number of eyewitnesses, the early dating of the sources, and the transformation of Jesus' followers. Unlike many critics who dismiss Christianity without deep investigation, Rogan's curiosity led him to acknowledge that the resurrection claim is not easily refuted. One of the biggest factors that caught Rogan's attention was the claim of over 500 eyewitnesses who saw the risen Jesus at once, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. Rogan frequently interviews historians, scientists, and researchers, and he understands that eyewitness testimony is crucial in any historical event. While skeptics argue that people can be mistaken, the idea that hundreds of individuals simultaneously experience the same hallucination is highly improbable. The fact that this claim appears in one of the earliest Christian creeds, within decades of Jesus' death, makes it even harder to dismiss as legend. It interested Rogan that the tomb was empty and that Jesus' enemies never attempted to refute this claim. If the resurrection was a hoax, it should have been simple for Roman and Jewish authorities to squelch the rumor by producing Jesus' body. But even back then, history tells us, critics of Christianity never denied the tomb's empty status. They only tried to explain it through various means. Added to its founding in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus was executed, made it difficult for Rogan to look past the resurrection's claim to veracity. Another of Rogan's powerful arguments revolved around the drastic change in the lives of the disciples of Jesus. They were cowards, scattered, and hiding prior to the resurrection. Afterward, they began fearlessly preaching in the face of torture and execution. Rogan knows from discussions with ex-special forces and psychologists that men will not typically die for something they know to be a lie. The fact that the disciples were willing to suffer for their witness indicates that they honestly believed they saw Jesus alive again. In the end, Joe Rogan didn't assert that he believed in the resurrection, but he didn't toss it away completely either. He stated that something significant happened, according to the weight of historical evidence, after Jesus died that changed the entire course of history. His openness to the evidence instead of discounting it because of prejudice is exactly what keeps the resurrection one of the hottest subjects in human history. Ultimately, whether one believes or does not believe in supernaturalism, Rogan has shown that the resurrection is not merely a point of faith. It is a serious historical question that demands a fair hearing. Mind-blowing, right? But now, I want to hear from you. Was this just legend, or is history telling us something bigger? Drop a comment below. If you enjoyed this, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more deep dives. And don't stop here. Check out the next video on your screen for even more shocking revelations. See you there.